Gaming has truly made a shift in the past year or two, all thanks to the multitude of handheld devices being released. We have devices like the GPD Win 3, the Aya Neo from Ryzen, and now, even more recently, we've seen the even more impressive Onexplayer come to fruition. Even Valve are pushing to release their own take, which they're apparently to name the Steam Pal. But for now, let's compare the two strongest players in the game, the Onexplayer versus GPD Win 3. Okay, first of all, we ought to take a look at the obvious, the physical aspects of each handheld device. On one hand, we have the GPD Win 3. It's a substantially smaller device than the One X at just 7.6 by 3.6 inches. The screen is a mere 5.5 inches, which is exactly 2.9 inches smaller than the screen on the Onexplayer. It's a much smaller device in almost every way. In fact, it's about the same size as the Nintendo Switch Lite, for reference sake. Unlike many of the recently released handhelds, the GPD Win 3 takes on a much more different approach to the design. Instead of straight up stealing the Switch's design, like so many do, the Win 3 has gone for a design that involves a behind-the-screen sliding keyboard, which can be either a bad thing or a great thing, depending on how you look at it. It does make the Windows 10 usability just that bit more fluid, but at the same time, it's fiddly and frankly clunky. When it comes to controls, what you have is a very familiar layout with the basic thumbsticks, which are laid out horizontally rather than diagonally like on the Switch, a D-pad, and the A, B, X, Y buttons. But on top of that is a fingerprint sensor, gamepad to mouse switch button, as well as two customizable buttons. The majority of the Windows 10 functionality is not in the buttons though, but rather in the keyboard behind the screen. Coolest part of the Win 3 though is by far the designated docking system, courtesy of Nintendo for coming up with that idea. However, this docking system is a lot more useful than the hunk of plastic that comes with the Switch. The Win 3 has a USB-C port located on the base of the device, which can be connected up to pretty much anything, but it's mainly for the dock connection. With the dock, you get access to an array of new opportunities because of the selection of ports in the dock, which include 3 USB Type-A ports, 1 USB Type-C port, and a HDMI and RJ45 network port. That means you can use the dock as an adapter to create a full-on PC. For one, it can connect up to a 4K screen, keyboard, and mouse all at once, and better yet, it can be integrated with an external eGFX to really amp up that performance. So yeah, for the right amount of money, it can be upgraded beyond its standard abilities. Alright, so how about the Onexplayer then? Could it be better than the GPD Win 3 when it comes to the design and functions? Well, yeah and no. Let me explain. There's a big downside to the One X, and that is its huge size. Don't get me wrong, that is also a really great thing, but it just means it's less of a transportable device than the GPD Win 3. Admittedly, this isn't a big issue because if you're getting the One X, then I'm assuming you want a large device, so I really can't fault it for that. But at 11 by 5 inches, it is a pretty big device. To get a generous 8.4-inch screen, which is probably one of the most immersive handheld screens you'll ever use, surprisingly, it's not a thick device at all, as it's just an inch thick, which is actually the same as the Win 3. But equally, the One X doesn't have a dedicated keyboard behind the screen. What the One X does have though is, firstly, an optional attachable keyboard similar to the Surface Pro's, and secondly, a selection of Windows 10 unique function buttons dotted on either side of the controls, which I would argue is a whole lot less fiddly than a mini keyboard. Also, another key difference is the thumbstick placement because while the Win 3s are horizontally aligned, the ones on the One X are placed at a diagonal alignment, much like the Switch. Personally, I find it to be more comfortable and usable, so I'd have to give that to the One X. Aside from that, you get the basic buttons like the D-pad and ABXY button mash, so it's pretty much an enlarged version of the Switch in that aspect. The Onexplayer's similarities to the Switch design are notable because they took a lot of what Nintendo did and improved it. For instance, it has a stand on the back, except instead of being placed awkwardly on the side, it's in the middle and a lot more sturdy. That's something that the GPD Win 3 doesn't have, but then again, it's considerably smaller, so using a stand to play at a distance is probably pointless anyway. One very notable similarity that the Onexplayer has with the GPD Win 3 is the connectivity options. It doesn't have a docking system, unfortunately, which is a bit of a missed opportunity, but it does have two USB 4.0 ports which open up the opportunity to connect your device to an external 4K monitor or two HD monitors, while at the same time having an eGPU connected to ramp up performance. What that means is that you can transform it into a full-fledged gaming PC. That's a feature that both the Onexplayer and GPD Win 3 share respectively. Right, so how do both handhelds compare on the specification sheet? Both range from an i5 model to an i7, and their costs change accordingly. For simplicity's sake, I'll compare the best models of each device. This is a very close matchup because they share remarkably similar specifications, so it really comes down to the finer details here. The Onexplayer and the Win 3 both have 11th gen Intel Core i7s. Both have Intel Iris Xe GPUs. They both have exactly 16GB of DDR4 RAM, so on almost every front, they are the same. However, a minuscule advantage does go to the One X when it comes to the SSD space because while the Win 3 has 1TB, the One X has 2TB. It is the bigger device though, so larger storage was a given, but also considering the tiny size of the Win 3 in comparison, it really is impressive that it's able to pack all that in there. Although it does beg the question of whether or not all that hardware in such a small frame will cool properly. But hey, no reason to doubt the Win 3 so far. Where the Onexplayer does separate itself from the Win 3 and actually every other handheld is its screen. While the Win 3 has a small 5.5-inch 720p screen, the Onexplayer has a very impressive 2K 8.4-inch screen. It's also brighter, more colorful, and has a higher PPI. No doubt games will look really great on that crisp screen. Presumably though, the demanding screen would mean that the FPS of games would be pretty bad and more importantly, a worse battery life. Well, not exactly. Even with a pretty hardcore screen and a heavy game, the Onexplayer can achieve 2 to 3 hours because of its 15,400 mAh battery. As for the FPS, well, the Witcher 3 Wild Hunt managed to maintain between 75 to 87 frames per second, which goes without saying, that is really, really good. Of course, that was tested on the absolute lowest settings, but still impressive nonetheless. On the other hand, the Win 3 has a whopping max battery life of 11 hours, and around 3 hours while playing heavy games. The Witcher 3, tested on low settings, averaged around 76 FPS, which is pretty much the same as the One X. That result is about as expected considering they have almost the exact same internals, so that's certainly interesting. So what's the verdict then? Well, you got two virtually identical handhelds here. I mean, if we're talking about the design, no, they are very different, and I'd have to say the Onexplayer definitely does have the better overall design because of the preferable button and thumbstick layout. I also think I just prefer the larger device in general. However, functionality-wise, both consoles are on par because they both have the ability to be adapted into a full-fledged gaming PC. Although I do really like the GPD Win 3's addition of a proper docking system. Having said that, when it comes to specifications, the One X is objectively better because, yeah, they have almost indistinguishable hardware, but the One X has a significantly better screen and slightly more storage, which gives it that slight edge. From a logical standpoint, it's very easy to say that the Onexplayer is the better device, but for the top model, you're paying $1,600, which is around $300 more than what the top GPD Win 3 model costs. So it's not like you're getting better value for money with the One X. You get exactly what you pay for. Because the comparison is so closely matched, I think it's down to what you'd prefer. A smaller, and cheaper but equally capable device than the Win 3 is for you. Alternatively, you want a larger and slightly more expensive device, then the Onexplayer is for you. Personally, I like the One X a little more, but I'd like to know what you think. Anyways, which one would you get if you could? Let me know in the comments below and be sure to like the video. Hey, even subscribe if you're feeling generous.